For decades, the Mesa at Skinwalker Ranch has stood in the Utah desert like a silent wall, massive, ancient, and apparently ordinary. But beneath that rock, investigators believe they have encountered something that should not be there. Something that has resisted drilling, something that has produced strange readings, and something that has forced researchers to ask a question far more disturbing than whether Skinwalker Ranch is haunted. What if the mystery isn't in the sky at all, but buried inside the ground? The Uinta Basin is a harsh landscape. Dry valleys stretch beneath enormous cliffs, the wind moves through empty fields, and at night the darkness seems almost complete. It is here, on a remote property in northeastern Utah, that Skinwalker Ranch became famous for reports of strange lights, unexplained objects, unusual animal incidents, and bizarre experiences. But stories are not evidence. That is why the Mesa became so important. Instead of chasing something moving across the night sky, researchers began looking beneath their feet. Using electromagnetic instruments, radar, aerial imaging, and other surveying techniques, investigators identified areas they believed contained unusual underground features. Some scans appeared to show voids, structures, or dense objects below the surface. Any one of those readings could have a conventional explanation. Rock layers can create strange reflections. Minerals can distort electromagnetic measurements. Fractures can look like empty spaces. And equipment can produce misleading results. So researchers needed something better than an image on a screen. They needed physical evidence. That meant drilling, and drilling into the Mesa would become one of the most controversial experiments ever conducted at the ranch. The objective was straightforward: reach an underground anomaly and determine what was actually there. But the deeper the drilling went, the stranger the investigation became. According to accounts documented by the Secret of Skinwalker Ranch investigation, drilling encountered extremely hard material and unexpected obstructions. In earlier attempts, investigators believed the drill was moving around an underground object rather than simply passing through uniform rock. Then fragments came back to the surface, metallic pieces, material that investigators considered unusual, and eventually ceramic-like fragments that became the focus of laboratory testing. This was the moment the mystery changed. A strange light in the sky can disappear before anyone gets close enough to study it. A mysterious sound can be blamed on the environment. A strange sensor reading can be questioned. But a physical fragment is different. You can hold it, cut it, magnify it, analyze its chemical composition, test its electrical and magnetic properties, and if it behaves in an unexpected way, you can try to reproduce that behavior. That is exactly what researchers attempted with material recovered from the Mesa. Some of the samples were reported to contain familiar elements, including titanium, iron, aluminum, calcium, and vanadium. None of these elements is mysterious, and their presence does not prove extraterrestrial technology. But investigators became interested in the material's unusual characteristics and microscopic behavior. One experiment became particularly intriguing. Researchers examined a sample under an electron microscope and reported an apparent change in a damaged area after exposure to an electron beam. The team interpreted the effect as possible self-healing behavior. If independently reproduced and properly explained, that could make the material scientifically interesting. But it would still not prove that the material came from another world, and that distinction matters. Because the real mystery isn't whether someone can give the material a terrifying name. The real mystery is whether scientists can determine what it actually is. Was it created naturally? Was it manufactured? Was it deposited there by human activity? Or could it represent a process that researchers have never encountered before? There was another clue buried in the story, one that seemed almost absurdly ordinary. A coin. A 1964 nickel reportedly recovered from deep drilling became part of the debate surrounding whether humans had previously disturbed the area. If that object truly originated from the depth claimed, then someone needed to explain how it got there. And suddenly, the Mesa was no longer just a geological mystery. It was potentially a historical one. Because if people had already been digging into this mountain decades ago, the most frightening question might not be what scientists just discovered. It might be what someone else discovered first. The possibility that someone had investigated the Mesa before modern researchers arrived changes the entire picture. A 1964 nickel is not proof of a secret operation. It could have entered the drilling process through contamination, or there could be a conventional explanation for its presence. But if the coin genuinely came from the underground material being examined, it raises a question that cannot simply be ignored. Why was a modern object apparently buried hundreds of feet inside the Mesa? And more importantly, was it connected to an earlier excavation? The Uinta Basin has a long history of human activity. Mining, drilling, construction, ranching, and geological exploration have all occurred throughout the region. So an artificial explanation must always be considered before jumping to something extraordinary. But the Mesa presented another problem. Investigators were not chasing just one anomaly. They were finding several. During earlier drilling operations documented by the Skinwalker Ranch investigation, researchers encountered what they interpreted as a dome-shaped underground anomaly. Attempts to approach it from different directions reportedly produced unexpected resistance, and drilling recovered metallic fragments. That result was important because it transformed an invisible anomaly into something physical. Still, the physical evidence had to be interpreted carefully. A metal fragment does not automatically mean a machine was buried underground. It could be industrial debris. It could be part of old equipment. It could have entered the subsurface through previous drilling. Or it could have originated from a completely natural geological process. The only way to narrow those possibilities was laboratory analysis, and that analysis produced another strange clue. Researchers reported that the recovered material contained elements associated with high-performance materials, including titanium and vanadium. Those elements are used in aerospace, industrial alloys, and many other advanced applications. But again, the presence of those elements does not establish an aerospace origin. That distinction became one of the most important challenges facing the investigation. The more unusual the material appeared, the easier it became for speculation to outrun evidence. And Skinwalker Ranch had no shortage of speculation. For years, the property had been surrounded by stories of unidentified lights, strange objects, electromagnetic disturbances, and unexplained experiences. Some reports came from witnesses. Others were recorded by instruments. Some remain impossible to independently verify. The Mesa became the physical centerpiece of those stories. If something unusual was happening above the ranch, perhaps the answer was below it. That hypothesis was compelling. But science demands more than a compelling hypothesis. It demands a test. So researchers began examining the underground material with increasingly sophisticated methods. The ceramic fragments were especially intriguing. They did not simply want to know what elements were present. They wanted to understand the material's microscopic structure and physical behavior. That meant exposing samples to controlled conditions. One reported experiment involved an electron microscope, where researchers observed a damaged area of the sample and then noticed changes after the electron beam was removed. The investigators described the effect as resembling self-repair. It was a remarkable observation. But remarkable observations can be deceptive. Materials can change under intense electron irradiation. Heat can accumulate. Atoms can migrate. Electrical charging can alter microscopic images. Chemical and structural transformations can occur at scales invisible to the naked eye. So the correct scientific response is not immediately, "We have discovered something impossible." It is, "Let's do it again." If the effect is real, repeated experiments should reveal it. If it is an artifact, controlled testing should expose the cause. And if the behavior turns out to represent an unusual physical property, researchers can begin identifying the mechanism behind it. That is where the Mesa mystery became genuinely fascinating. The terrifying possibility was not necessarily that an alien object had been buried inside the mountain. The more unsettling possibility was that researchers might have found a material whose origin could eventually be traced to something entirely unexpected. Because if the material was manufactured, somebody made it. If it was natural, geology produced it. And if it was neither easily explained by known geological processes nor ordinary human activity, then the investigation would have reached a very different level. But before anyone could make that leap, another question had to be answered. Exactly where did the material come from? The depth mattered. The location mattered. The surrounding rock mattered. And every inch of the drilling path mattered. Because if the strange fragments came from the precise underground target, identified by independent measurements, the discovery would become much harder to dismiss as coincidence. The researchers therefore returned to the Mesa with a simple objective: find the anomaly again, then reach it. And this time, don't just bring back a fragment. Find out what is waiting on the other side of the rock. The drill became the most important instrument on the mountain, not because it was sophisticated, because it could cross the boundary between speculation and physical evidence. Above ground, researchers could map the Mesa, scan its surface, and record electromagnetic activity. Below ground, however, the picture became far less certain. Every layer of rock could distort a signal. Every fracture could create an apparent void. Every dense mineral deposit could resemble something artificial. The drill offered a brutal solution. Go there, touch it, bring something back. But reaching a precise underground target is much harder than it sounds. Imagine trying to hit a small object buried deep beneath hundreds of feet of rock while standing on the surface, with only indirect measurements telling you where it is. A tiny error in angle or position can send the drill dozens of feet away from the target. That is why the earlier drilling results were so important. Investigators reported that the drill encountered unusual resistance and recovered fragments they believed were associated with the underground anomaly. History later described one of the earlier discoveries as a mysterious object beneath the mesa that appeared difficult to penetrate, with metal fragments recovered during the attempt. But the real question remained unanswered. What was the object? The answer could have been geological, it could have been human-made, or it could have been something investigators had never encountered before. Without the complete object, nobody could know. And that uncertainty pushed the team deeper. At the same time, another branch of the investigation was producing its own mystery. The ceramic material. Unlike the metallic fragments, ceramic samples offered a completely different scientific problem. Ceramics can survive extreme temperatures, resist corrosion, and possess unusual electrical properties depending on their composition and manufacturing process. They are not inherently mysterious. In fact, modern technology depends on them. But the investigators believed the samples recovered from the mesa displayed characteristics worth further examination. So the material was taken into the laboratory. Under magnification, its structure became visible in ways impossible to see with the naked eye. Then researchers began applying energy to the sample. The electron microscope experiment became one of the most dramatic moments associated with the material. The team reported observing a damaged region change after electron beam exposure, interpreting the apparent restoration as possible self-healing behavior. That sounds like something from science fiction. But science has a habit of producing results that sound impossible until the mechanism is understood. Materials can repair microscopic damage through diffusion, chemical reactions, phase changes, or other processes. Some engineered materials are deliberately designed to heal cracks or restore functionality. So the question wasn't whether self-healing materials exist. They do. The question was whether this particular sample genuinely exhibited such a property, and under what physical conditions. That distinction mattered enormously, because if the behavior could be reproduced independently, the material might deserve serious materials science investigation. If it could not, then the original observation might have resulted from the experimental setup. And there was another problem. Even if the ceramic proved extraordinary, that would still not tell researchers where it came from. A material can be unusual without being extraterrestrial. A human engineer could create something extraordinary. Nature can create structures that look manufactured. And the Earth contains countless materials whose properties were once unknown. The origin question therefore remained open. Meanwhile, the broader ranch investigation continued producing reports of unusual electromagnetic activity. Researchers have used a wide range of sensors at Skinwalker Ranch, attempting to determine whether reported phenomena correspond with measurable physical changes. But unusual readings are notoriously difficult to interpret. An electromagnetic spike could originate from equipment. It could come from a nearby transmitter. It could be atmospheric. It could be geological, or it could have another explanation entirely. The important question is whether the same phenomenon appears repeatedly under controlled conditions. That was what made the mesa so valuable. It provided a fixed location. Researchers could return to the same coordinates. They could compare measurements over time. They could drill at predicted locations. They could recover material, and then they could test that material away from the ranch. The investigation was slowly becoming a chain of experiments, and chains can be broken. If even one major link failed, the larger theory could collapse. But if multiple independent measurements pointed toward the same underground region, confidence would grow. That was exactly what researchers were trying to establish. Was there actually a structure beneath the mesa? Was it producing the unusual readings? And could the strange materials recovered from the rock be physically connected to it? Those questions became even more significant when investigators began considering the relationship between what was happening underground and what was being observed above the ranch. Because the strangest reports at Skinwalker Ranch rarely remain confined to one location. Lights appear in the sky, instruments react, animals behave unexpectedly, people report unusual sensations, and sometimes these events seem to cluster around particular areas. That does not prove a common cause, but it creates a testable hypothesis. If the mesa is somehow connected to the aerial phenomena, measurable changes might occur when an unusual object appears overhead. And if researchers could record those changes simultaneously from multiple instruments, they might finally begin separating coincidence from correlation. Then the mystery would become much bigger than one mountain. It would become a question about an entire environment. And that was exactly what the researchers began preparing to test. Because the next clue would not come from inside the rock. It would come from the space directly above it. Above the mesa, the sky became another laboratory. For years, witnesses at Skinwalker Ranch had described strange lights and unidentified objects moving through the airspace above the property. But researchers faced an obvious problem. Seeing something unusual does not reveal what it is. A light could be an aircraft. A reflection could become an apparent object. A distant satellite could appear to move unpredictably. Even experienced observers can misjudge distance and size when there are no familiar reference points. That is why the investigation increasingly depended on instruments. Cameras could record, radar could track, radio frequency sensors could monitor the electromagnetic spectrum. And when several independent systems registered an event at the same time, researchers had something far more valuable than a story. They had a data set. The central question was whether the activity above the ranch could somehow correspond with what was happening beneath the mesa. That possibility was extraordinary. But extraordinary does not mean impossible. Geology and electromagnetic physics can interact in complicated ways. Certain minerals can affect magnetic fields. Electrical currents can move through conductive structures. Atmospheric conditions can create unusual optical effects. Radio signals can reflect from terrain and atmospheric layers. The challenge was identifying the actual mechanism. Researchers therefore continued testing the environment around the mesa while investigating the underground anomalies. This created an unusual scientific puzzle. Imagine detecting an unexplained signal in the sky while, at nearly the same coordinates, underground sensors indicate something unusual below the surface. The immediate temptation is to connect them. But correlation alone cannot establish causation. The sky event might be unrelated. The underground anomaly might be unrelated. Or both could be responses to a third phenomenon. That third possibility was particularly important, because the mesa itself might not be generating anything. It could simply be sitting above a geological feature capable of influencing the environment. Or it could be interacting with external energy. Or researchers might be seeing multiple unrelated anomalies and unconsciously turning them into one story. Only repeated experiments could separate those possibilities. And that is why the drilling continued to matter. A laboratory sample can be studied under controlled conditions. An underground structure can be mapped. A signal can be measured. But the real breakthrough would come from connecting those observations without assuming the answer beforehand. The investigators also had to confront an uncomfortable possibility. What if the strange material was human-made? If that were true, the mystery would shift from physics to history. Who manufactured it? How did it reach the mesa? Was it part of an old industrial operation? Was it left behind by earlier drilling? Could the reported 1964 nickel indicate that people had previously excavated the same area? The coin could not answer those questions by itself, but it added another layer to an already complicated investigation. And history has a habit of hiding in places that seem untouched. A landscape can appear ancient while containing evidence of modern activity beneath the surface. Old wells become buried, mining shafts collapse, equipment disappears. Construction debris becomes trapped underground. A site can look pristine while its subsurface has been disturbed repeatedly. That meant the investigators needed to reconstruct the history of the mesa as carefully as they were studying its geology. The problem was that Skinwalker Ranch had accumulated decades of stories, rumors, and claims. Separating historical evidence from folklore was difficult. Some accounts could be documented. Others depended entirely on personal testimony. And some had been repeated so many times that the original source became impossible to identify. That made the physical samples especially valuable. A fragment can be tested, chemical composition can be measured, a borehole can be mapped, a sensor recording can be analyzed, but even physical evidence has limits. A sample tells you what it is made of. It does not necessarily tell you who put it there. A magnetic anomaly tells you that something affected the sensor. It does not necessarily tell you why. A strange object in the sky tells you that something was observed. It does not automatically identify the object. This was the paradox at the heart of the mesa. The investigation had accumulated more physical evidence than ever before, yet the explanation remained elusive. And then the ceramic material introduced an even stranger possibility. If the reported microscopic behavior was genuine, perhaps the material itself contained the clue. Researchers could test how it responded to heat. They could examine its electrical characteristics. They could study its structure. They could compare it against known terrestrial materials. The goal was not to prove a supernatural theory. The goal was to eliminate possibilities. That is how science advances. One explanation at a time: natural geology, human contamination, manufactured material, unknown physical process. And only after those possibilities have been rigorously examined can more extraordinary hypotheses become scientifically meaningful. But there was something about the mesa that kept pulling the investigation back toward one uncomfortable idea. The anomalies appeared to be concentrated. They weren't scattered randomly across hundreds of miles. They repeatedly drew attention to particular locations, and the mesa was one of them. If the underground targets were real, and if the aerial events were real, and if the electromagnetic measurements were real, the most important question was whether they shared a measurable signature. That would change the investigation completely. Because then researchers wouldn't simply have a collection of mysteries, they would have a pattern. And patterns are where mysteries become testable. The team now had to find out whether that pattern existed, not in a dramatic story, not in a theory, but in the numbers. Numbers don't care what a place is supposed to mean. They don't know the legends surrounding Skinwalker Ranch. They don't know what witnesses believe they saw. and they don't care whether an investigator expects something extraordinary to happen. That is why measurements became so important. The researchers could record electromagnetic activity, temperature, radiation, magnetic fields, and other environmental variables without deciding in advance what those measurements meant. The goal was simple: find the pattern first, explain it second. At the Mesa, that philosophy became increasingly important because the underground targets were difficult to interpret. A radar image could suggest a structure, but only drilling could potentially reveal its physical nature. An electromagnetic anomaly could indicate something unusual, but only repeated measurements could establish whether the signal was persistent. And persistence is everything. A single unexplained event is interesting. A repeated event is a problem. If the same anomaly appears at the same location under different conditions, researchers have something they can investigate systematically. That was the challenge facing the team. Was the Mesa producing repeatable anomalies, or were investigators simply collecting unrelated strange events and connecting them after the fact? The answer could determine whether the entire mystery was physical or psychological. Because human beings are pattern-seeking creatures, we see faces in clouds, we connect unrelated events. We remember unusual experiences more vividly than ordinary ones, and when a location already has a reputation for strange activity, expectation can influence observation. That doesn't mean every report is false. It means extraordinary claims require stronger controls. Skinwalker Ranch, therefore, became an unusual test of scientific discipline. The investigators needed to remain open-minded without becoming convinced too early. That balance is incredibly difficult, especially when an experiment appears to produce something unexpected. The ceramic material was one example. The investigators reported that a sample exhibited unusual behavior under electron microscopy. If genuine, that could point toward a fascinating physical process. But the correct response was not certainty, it was replication. A result becomes much more powerful when another laboratory can reproduce it without being told what it is supposed to find. That is the difference between an intriguing observation and established science. The same principle applies to the underground structures. If multiple instruments independently identify the same target, confidence increases. If drilling reaches the predicted coordinates and repeatedly recovers matching material, confidence increases again. But if each method produces a different picture, the anomaly becomes less convincing. This is why the Mesa investigations continued to focus on physical verification. The researchers wanted to know what was actually beneath the surface, and in the process they encountered a fascinating possibility. The unusual material might not be the object itself. It could be debris, it could be a coating, it could be part of a larger structure, or it could simply be an unrelated material that happened to be recovered from the same area. Without the original context, even a remarkable sample can be misleading. Imagine finding a fragment of metal in an archaeological site. The metal may be thousands of years old, or it may have fallen from a modern machine yesterday. The fragment itself cannot tell you the date. Context does. The same is true beneath the Mesa. Depth matters. Rock layers matter. Drilling records matter. Contamination controls matter. And the exact location where every sample was recovered matters. This is why the reported nickel became such an interesting detail. The 1964 date stamped into the coin potentially provided a clue about human activity. But it also created another scientific requirement: prove the depth, prove the chain of custody, prove the coin wasn't introduced during drilling. Only then could it become meaningful evidence. That same standard applies to the ceramic and metallic fragments. If the materials were truly recovered from the predicted underground anomaly, that is significant. If they entered the sample through another route, the interpretation changes completely. The deeper lesson is that mystery doesn't disappear when science arrives. It becomes more precise. Instead of asking, "Is something strange happening?" researchers ask, "Where? When? How often? Under what conditions? Can it be reproduced? Can another team observe it? Can the result survive an attempt to disprove it?" Those questions may sound less exciting than stories about portals and extraterrestrial technology, but they are far more powerful. Because if an anomaly survives them, it becomes difficult to dismiss, and that is exactly what made the Mesa so compelling. Despite years of investigation, researchers continued finding questions rather than definitive answers. The rock remained, the underground targets remained, the material remained, and the reported aerial phenomena continued to complicate the picture. Then came the possibility that all of these observations might be connected by something even more fundamental: energy. If the Mesa contained a structure capable of interacting with electromagnetic fields, it might produce measurable effects above ground. If a natural geological feature were responsible, it could potentially create a similar signature. Either way, the investigation needed to determine whether the environment changed when anomalies appeared. And that meant watching the sky and the ground simultaneously. Because if something happened overhead while instruments beneath the Mesa responded at precisely the same moment, researchers would finally have something they could analyze as a relationship, rather than a collection of isolated events. That would not prove a portal. It would not prove extraterrestrial technology, but it could reveal something far more valuable, a repeatable physical connection. And once researchers began looking for that connection, the Mesa stopped being just a mysterious mountain. It became the center of an experiment spanning the sky, the ground, and everything in between. The most important discovery was not necessarily something the researchers could pull from the ground. It was the possibility that the anomalies could be connected. For years, Skinwalker Ranch had been described through separate categories: strange lights in the sky, unusual electromagnetic readings, unexplained experiences, and mysterious objects beneath the surface. The Mesa sat at the intersection of those stories. But an intersection is not automatically a connection. To establish one, investigators needed simultaneous measurements. They needed to know what happened underground when something unusual appeared overhead. They needed to know whether electromagnetic readings changed before, during, or after an aerial event. And they needed enough independent data to rule out ordinary interference. That is a difficult standard, but it is the only standard that can turn an intriguing mystery into a scientific problem. The researchers therefore continued monitoring the environment around the Mesa while pursuing physical targets underground. Their equipment became increasingly important because human observation could only cover a fraction of what was happening. A person can look at the sky. A camera can record continuously. A radio frequency sensor can monitor frequencies humans cannot hear. A magnetometer can detect changes invisible to the eye. A thermal camera can reveal temperature differences. Each instrument sees a different piece of reality, and when those pieces overlap, the picture becomes stronger. This approach also exposes contradictions. A supposed aerial object might appear on camera but leave no radar signature. A radio signal might appear without any visible object. A magnetic anomaly might remain perfectly stable while everything else changes. Those inconsistencies are not failures, they are clues. If the Mesa were responsible for the phenomena, researchers might expect measurable environmental changes around it. If the anomalies came from external sources, the pattern might look completely different. And if there were no connection at all, the data should eventually reveal that too. This was the scientific crossroads. One explanation suggested an unknown physical phenomenon, another suggested unusual geology, another suggested human activity, and another suggested that the apparent pattern existed mainly because investigators were looking for one. The evidence had to decide. That is where the story becomes more complicated than the headline. There is no established scientific proof that Skinwalker Ranch contains extraterrestrial technology. There is no confirmed evidence of a portal beneath the Mesa. There is no publicly demonstrated mechanism showing that the ceramic fragments generate the aerial phenomena reported at the ranch. Those claims remain speculative. But the investigation itself is real. Researchers really have drilled into the Mesa. Physical samples really have been examined. Sensors really have been deployed. And investigators really have continued trying to understand anomalies they consider unexplained. That distinction matters, because mystery becomes more compelling when you don't need to exaggerate it. The actual, unanswered questions are already strange enough. What produced the underground targets? Why were unusual materials recovered? What caused the reported electromagnetic readings? What explains the aerial observations? And why do so many of these questions keep returning to the same small region of Utah? There may be one answer. There may be several. Or there may be no extraordinary connection at all. But the Mesa keeps forcing the same problem into view. Something has to explain the physical evidence. And if the explanation is geological, it could still be scientifically valuable. The Earth is full of extreme environments and unusual mineral structures. Geological formations can produce unexpected electrical, magnetic, and thermal behavior. If researchers eventually identify such a mechanism at Skinwalker Ranch, they could transform a famous paranormal location into an interesting geological case study. If the materials turn out to be human-made, the discovery could become a historical mystery instead. Someone may have conducted previous work in the area. Someone may have left behind equipment. Someone may have drilled into the Mesa decades before the modern team. And if that history can be documented, some of the mystery may disappear. But even then, one question would remain. Would that explain everything? Probably not automatically. A coin could indicate human activity. A piece of metal could be industrial debris. A strange ceramic could have a terrestrial origin. None of those explanations necessarily accounts for every reported aerial observation or electromagnetic event. This is why the investigation remains difficult. The evidence does not point cleanly in one direction. It creates competing possibilities. And that may be the most honest way to describe what scientists have actually found. Not a final answer, a narrowing field of possibilities. The terrifying secret inside the Mesa may therefore be much less cinematic than an alien artifact, but potentially more important. It may be an unknown combination of geology, human history, materials science, electromagnetic physics, and perception that researchers have not yet completely disentangled. Or, if future experiments produce independently reproducible anomalies that resist every conventional explanation, the conclusion could become much more extraordinary. That possibility is what keeps the investigation alive, because science does not promise that every mystery will have a boring answer. It promises something better, a method for finding out, and the Mesa is now sitting directly inside that process. Every drill core becomes a piece of evidence, every laboratory result becomes another filter, every failed hypothesis removes one possible explanation, and every repeatable anomaly becomes harder to ignore. The mountain itself remains silent. It does not reveal whether the strange material is ancient or modern, natural or manufactured, ordinary or unprecedented, but the instruments keep asking questions, and somewhere between the rock layers and the sky above them, the investigation is approaching its most important test. Not whether Skinwalker Ranch is supernatural, but whether the phenomenon can be measured well enough that scientists outside the ranch can independently see the same thing. Because once an anomaly survives distance, skepticism, repetition, and independent testing, it stops belonging to a television show. It becomes a scientific problem. And that is the threshold the Mesa has been approaching all along. And that is where the mystery of the Mesa ultimately leads. Not to a monster, not to a guaranteed extraterrestrial artifact, not to a proven portal hidden beneath the Utah desert, but to something much more difficult to confront, an unanswered question supported by pieces of physical evidence that still require explanation. The Mesa has produced strange underground targets, recovered materials, unusual laboratory observations, and a history complicated by reports of earlier human activity. Researchers have continued returning to the same location because the questions have not disappeared. And perhaps the most important revelation is that they don't have to disappear. A mystery does not become meaningless simply because science has not solved it yet. In fact, the opposite can be true. The unanswered parts are where the real investigation begins. Consider the ceramic material. The elements reported in samples from the Mesa are not alien elements. Titanium, iron, aluminum, calcium, and vanadium are all known on Earth. Their presence cannot establish extraterrestrial origin. But materials science is not simply a list of elements. Structure matters, processing matters, impurities matter. The way atoms are arranged can transform familiar ingredients into something with completely different properties. That means the important question remains open. What exactly is the material's structure, and how did it form? If future independent laboratories reproduce the unusual behavior reported by investigators, the material could become genuinely important to materials science. If conventional physics explains it, that would still be a discovery. If it turns out to be a previously misunderstood terrestrial material, the mystery would have a satisfying answer. And if repeated experiments reveal properties that cannot be explained by known processes, then the scientific community would have a far more serious problem to investigate. The same logic applies to the underground anomalies. A strange signal does not prove a hidden machine. A difficult drilling target does not prove an artificial structure. A recovered fragment does not prove an extraterrestrial origin. But if independent instruments repeatedly identify the same physical target, and drilling repeatedly reaches that target, and multiple laboratories analyze material from it with consistent results, the evidence becomes progressively stronger. That is how extraordinary discoveries are supposed to happen, not through one dramatic moment, through accumulation, one measurement, then another, until the ordinary explanations become increasingly difficult to sustain. And perhaps that is why the Mesa remains so compelling after all these years. It refuses to provide the one thing everyone wants most, certainty. Instead, it forces us to confront the limits of what we actually know. The reports of aerial phenomena may eventually prove to be aircraft, atmospheric effects, satellites, balloons, sensor artifacts, or something else. The electromagnetic anomalies may eventually have geological or technological explanations. The mysterious materials may turn out to have ordinary origins. The reported 1964 nickel may ultimately be explained by human activity, connected with an earlier excavation. Any of those outcomes would be valuable, because solving a mystery does not diminish it. It completes it. But there is another possibility. What if future researchers conduct the same experiments under controlled conditions and repeatedly obtain the same unexpected results? What if independent scientists examine the material and confirm unusual properties? What if the underground targets are mapped with multiple technologies and reveal a structure that cannot be explained by natural geology or known human activity? Then the story changes. At that point, Skinwalker Ranch would no longer simply be famous for strange stories. It would possess a physical anomaly demanding a scientific explanation. And that would be far more significant than any television headline, because science has never advanced by declaring something impossible. It advances when observations force researchers to improve their models, The Mesa could eventually become another example of that process. Or it could become a lesson in how easily human beings can turn uncertainty into mythology. Either way, there is something valuable in continuing the investigation carefully. The real danger is not that scientists might discover something terrifying. The real danger is allowing the desire for a spectacular answer to become stronger than the evidence. Skinwalker Ranch has attracted extraordinary claims for decades. The Mesa has become one of its most intriguing physical locations. But the responsible conclusion remains simple. Something has been investigated there. Some observations remain unexplained, and the explanations are not yet settled. That may sound less dramatic than saying an alien structure is buried inside the mountain, but it is much more honest, and honesty makes the mystery stronger. Because if the evidence eventually reveals something extraordinary, nobody will need to exaggerate it. The evidence will speak for itself. Imagine that moment. A laboratory somewhere far from Utah receives a sample from the Mesa. Researchers do not know the story. They don't know the legends. They don't know what they are expected to find. They test the material. Then they test it again and again. Different instruments, different researchers, different laboratories, the same unexpected result. That would be the moment when the mystery finally crossed a line. Not because someone said it was impossible, because independent science demonstrated that something genuinely unusual was happening. Until then, the Mesa remains exactly what it has always been, a massive formation of ancient rock, silent beneath the desert sky, holding evidence we have only partially understood. Maybe there is something extraordinary inside, maybe there isn't. But after years of investigation, one thing is undeniable. The most important discovery is not what we think is hidden inside the Mesa. It is the realization that we don't yet know. And that uncertainty is not the end of the story. It is the reason people keep digging, the reason scientists keep testing, the reason investigators return with better instruments. Because every unexplained signal, every recovered fragment, and every strange measurement carries the same possibility. That somewhere beneath those layers of rock is an answer waiting to be understood. And perhaps one day, the drill will reach it. When that happens, the question won't be whether the discovery is terrifying. It will be whether humanity is ready to accept whatever the evidence says. Until then, the Mesa keeps its secret. And maybe that is the most haunting thought of all. Not that something impossible is hiding beneath the mountain, but that something perfectly real may already be there, and we simply haven't learned how to recognize it yet. If this investigation made you question what you thought you knew about Skinwalker Ranch, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what you think is really hidden inside the Mesa. Because sometimes the greatest mysteries aren't the ones that have no evidence. They're the ones where the evidence is right in front of us, and we still don't know what it means.